Alright, welcome to your Test 3 review. I think by this point you know how the test works. It opens on Monday, closes on Friday. It's 50 multiple choice questions and you have 2 hours to complete it. So you guys should be familiar with the format, you guys should be good to go. Your previous test scores have been really good, I've been really encouraged by them, so I have no doubt that you will do just as well on this test, especially if you are actually one of those who watches these review videos. So that being said, let's go ahead and begin with your Test 3 review. This last unit we talked about a number of things, and we're going to go ahead and begin with where we started in week 12 with the Texas Judiciary, the Texas judicial system. When we talked about the judiciary, we talked about the different functions of the judiciary. The fact is that any judicial branch has basically these 3 main functions. The fact is that they are involved in the application of the law to individual cases. They're involved in judicial review, which allows them to review cases and decide on them. And also, every judiciary branch hears some appeals if they have appellate jurisdiction. Application of the laws involve finding of the facts. You need to know the facts of the case. You need to determine if the law applies to the facts that actually did develop. And you also need to interpret the applicable laws to the particular case. And then finally, once you get through that, you need to determine the legal rights of each party in the case and therefore decide the case overall. This is a very basic overview of the judiciary and how it functions and then what it does in terms of the law and how it applies it. Now we talked about judicial review as well in addition to application of the actual laws. Judicial review, I care that you at least know the definition for the purpose of your test. Judicial review occurs when any court determines whether a legislative, executive, or judicial action was valid under the law. Not every court used to have judicial review. Judicial review came about in Marbury versus Madison, which was a Supreme Court case in 1803. In Marbury versus Madison, the court actually gave itself the right to judicial review and enabled all courts in the United States to have judicial review so that they could review the particular points of the case and decide whether that was valid under the law. Before then, courts would just determine guilt or innocence. Now they'll actually look at the facts of the case and determine whether that was valid under law. They'll answer the questions of, did the policy-making body have the authority to make the policy? Did an executive official act within the scope of his authority that is granted to him? Or did a lower judicial court decide correctly or incorrectly? This actually gives the court it actually gives the courts the right to look at the law and actually apply them to the government themselves, which is basically the idea of judicial review. So, for the purpose of your test, just know that judicial review occurs when any court determines whether a legislative, executive, or judicial action was valid under the law. That's the basis of judicial review. All courts have that thanks to Marbury versus Madison, and now courts can look back at the facts of the case and decide whether the action was valid under that particular law. And judicial review also can review its own government now, or the judiciary branch can also review their own government now, thanks to the application of judicial review. I feel like I kind of rambled there. I kind of feel like that wasn't quite as clear enough, so if you do have questions about it, send it my way and I'll try to answer that as well. Let's go ahead and move on to the different types of law. And I do care that you know this for your test, that there are 2 basic types of law here in the U.S. There's civil law and then there's criminal law. In civil law, we kind of get the idea. We hear about it every now and then. Your parents may have been involved in it yourself or something like that, or maybe a certain company that you're familiar with was involved in civil law. We're very kind of familiar with that. We're also much more familiar with the idea of criminal law. Civil law is disputes among individuals and groups and corporations and government. It can involve things between individuals such as divorce. It can involve contract law between some entity and another entity. It can also involve intellectual disputes on, say, copyrights or, say, artist material, things like that, songs and things like that. Usually civil law doesn't involve any sort of jail time or anything like that. It's usually just, monetary or punitive payments to try to pay off the damages of the victims. On the other hand, the one that does require usually prison time or things like that is criminal law. Criminal law defines certain crimes and provides punishments by charging someone with violating a certain statute. The federal or the state government is always the prosecutor because you've always committed a crime against the state or against a federal statute or a state statute. And usually when you do that, the punishment usually involves a fine or imprisonment. Now you do have a certain guilt or innocent phase and then the sentencing phase. And then as soon as the sentencing phase is over, you'll actually have to pay your fine or serve your jail time. Criminal law, it can be crazy, such as murder or something like that, but it can also involve something so simple as speeding because you violated a state statute that set the speed limit among that particular stretch of highway or what have you. That's the idea of criminal law, is that you just broke a law and then you have to pay for it through either jail time or through paying your fines or something like that. In contrast to civil law, which defines, breaking a contract or a private sort of matter. So I care that you know for your test the difference between civil law and criminal law. I'll probably put the definition of both on there, and then you have to kind of pick out which one is which, and you can decide through that, and I have confidence that you guys can certainly do that, no problem. All right. Now talking about the actual court system itself, rather than just concepts of judicial review or civil law and criminal law. The basic features of the Texas court system is the fact that the Texas court system is decentralized. We talked about this. There's no single reporting authority. All court systems have a high level of independence to decide their own cases. The only time where certain courts may overlap with one another is when the case is on appeals from another court. All judges are elected, which is a unique feature to Texas. In Texas, all judges are elected except for municipal judges. And this is very unique because there's this idea that the judiciary should not be partisan. But judges have to run on a party ticket. They'll run as a Republican or they'll run as a Democrat. And the fact that all these judges are elected adds kind of a partisan aspect to the Texas court system, which is very unique. Not a lot of states have that. Texas courts are also highly specialized. Courts generally have specialized jurisdiction based on geography or content of the case. And so that Texas court system has become very specialized because particular courts know how to deal with that type of law that may apply with that case in that particular area. And so courts are highly specialized to focus just on the matter of that particular case and not deal with externalities that may deflect from their level of specialization. So those are unique. Those are basically the three unique features of the Texas judiciary. Courts in Texas are divided by their jurisdiction. That's why they're highly specialized. Jurisdiction, once again, is just the sphere of authority that a court has. It's either issue-based or geographic-based. Issue-based would mean that they only deal with civil law or they deal with only criminal law. Geographic-based means that they only deal with the laws that apply in a particular boundary or a particular district that is set up by the state. And that's what I mean by geographic-based. They only focus on the jurisdiction within that particular area, say only Harris County or only Galveston County, those sorts of things. Things that are geographically divided based on some lines that the state has set up. There's different types of jurisdiction. We talked about the difference between original jurisdiction, appellate jurisdiction, exclusive jurisdiction, and then geographical jurisdiction. Original jurisdiction means that it's the court of origin. It hears the case and the evidence first and establishes ultimately the record of the case. Appellate jurisdiction means that they hear the appeals of the case from a lower court. They're hearing it on appeals. It may be the second or the third time the case has been heard. They just want to review the facts and maybe overturn the court's original decision, or maybe uphold the original court's decision. And finally, exclusive jurisdiction means that a court has the sole right to hear the case. No one else gets to hear it, only they do. And then geographical, we already kind of talked about this, where a court is within the geographical area in which the crime or the lawsuit took place, so it only happens within that geographic area, and they get to hear all cases from the geographical boundaries that are defined. So please know for the purpose of your test the different types of jurisdiction, be able to identify which one is which one gets to hear the case first, which one hears it on appeals, which one is the only court to hear the case, and then which one is the one that gets to hear the case geographically based on some sort of geographic region. You guys should be good to go there. Just kind of maybe pause this video, review that real quick, and you guys should be good to go for your test. I can guarantee there will be questions about jurisdiction on your test though, so be prepared. And then finally with the judiciary, we talked about different concerns about the Texas judicial system. The fact is that there's considerations of structural reorganization, since the state courts are very diverse, very different. We need also, within the Texas judicial system, we need clearer lines of authority, things like that. Sometimes, is it civil law, is it criminal law, did it happen here, did it happen there? Compensation for victims of the crime is pretty low here in Texas, and then also Texas also has a very crowded docket. There are so many cases happening in Texas, especially with the population boom. I can only imagine that it's getting worse. The fact is that the Texas judicial system has a lot of cases that need to be heard, and it has an overcrowded docket. In terms of political concerns is the fact that judges are often bought off. There's campaign contributions to candidates for judge. Judges are often bought off to promote an agenda or to pay off. It's sort of like a bribe system, more or less, here in Texas. That's what I'm trying to get to. the campaign contributions kind of set up this bribe system so that certain people can get away with the law, certain people can't. Partisan elections also focus on political issues rather than judicial competency. Judges will actually debate one another on the political issues rather than how much do they actually know about the law and how much have they actually had experience with the law. So focusing on political issues takes away from the judicial competency and judicial experience that most voters should be focused on rather than the political issues. At-large elections also eliminate minority judges. Texas judicial system does not have a lot of diversity. Minority judges are very few and far between here in Texas, so that's another side effect of the elections. And then also disciplining and removal of judges is very hard since they are elected officials. There's not necessarily a way to remove a judge except for them losing an election. But the fact is that Texas being such a one-party state, the judges often keep their seats, even if they have done terrible deeds or have done a terrible job as a judge overall. So disciplining and removal of judges is extremely hard since they are elected officials. So those are just briefly some of the concerns about the judicial system. May not be anything particular on your test about this particular slide, but it is good to know and good to debate these sorts of things and be aware of these sorts of things as you think about your own system of Texas politics that we have here in the state. All right. Moving on from week 12, we moved on to week 13. We talked about the Texas bureaucracy. Not a whole lot to review here, but I can guarantee there will be at least a few questions about the Texas bureaucracy on your test. I want you to know first and foremost the definition of bureaucracy, which is this first one here that I'll probably put on your test: an agency of government and their employees charged with specific tasks and duties and supported by public funding. Bureaucracy can also be defined as a set of complex hierarchical departments, agencies, commissions, and staffs to help the executive branch carry out its duties. The bureaucracy is basically the hands-on part of government. It's often seen as a fourth branch of government because they actually do the government's dirty work. They're the agencies, the certain different types of commissions and committees and agencies and things like that actually do the work of the government. They carry out the specific tasks and they help out the executive branch. They're often hierarchical. The organization revolves around a structure of executive departments, agencies, and offices. You'll have heads of departments, you'll have deputy directors, you'll have directors, you'll have things like that. You'll have this huge office staff that actually does the work of the government. That's essentially what the bureaucracy is. Bureaucracy communicates with each other to coordinate all the specializations within their organization. The implementation of laws is their main key function. They translate the law into employee routines. Legislation is not self-executing, so it must be implemented by these agencies. Bureaucracies sometimes engage in rulemaking. They'll set up certain amounts of fines. They'll set up what you can and can't do. And therefore, they're also engaged in quasi-judicial decision-making, meaning that they'll hand out fines, they'll hand out punishments, kind of like a judicial branch would do, but without the interference of the judicial branch. They'll do it independently by themselves. And as I've mentioned already, their purpose is that similar to a fourth branch of government. Now, the thing I want you to know most about the bureaucracy, besides the definition, obviously, would just be the fact that the bureaucracy system has really changed. Until the late 19th century, the bureaucracy was mainly a spoils system. Jobs were rewarded to those with connections. Those that knew politicians and people in power were able to get jobs within the bureaucracy. And in return, they would offer up their support, their votes in the next round, their undying allegiance, their financial support as well. And politicians, in exchange for support, would reward them with jobs. Now, the federal law prohibits the spoils system, but the fact is that there are still some spoils system jobs in place. Federal law states that you must have unelected officials. Their job must be based on merit and qualifications. And then usually most have a college degree related in that field. So they've studied that field for a while, and they hold nonpartisan offices. You can go down to your local bureaucratic agency, maybe say the DMV or something like that, and you can ask them, what is your political affiliation, and they might offer it up. But the title that they hold, their job title, does not come with a political affiliation overall. Now, as I mentioned, Texas still does have a few of those patronage jobs or those spoil system jobs intact, though. There's approximately about 3,000 jobs that are rewarded through spoils, and most are through appointment by the governor. If you're trying to get a job that requires an appointment by the governor, it's probably a good thing to know the governor pretty well. And that's kind of the idea of the spoils system. It's not as rampant as it used to be, but there are still a few examples every now and then. Usually heads of agencies are also filled through the spoils system. They also have they got to their head of the agency by knowing people, but then also the fact that they hire their own spoils, being a head of agency, they can also reward spoils jobs based on their own power. Because they're head of agency, they have certain amounts of power. So they have the flexibility to hire spoils in addition to maybe being spoils themselves. But that's only 3,000 jobs. For the most part, Texas bureaucratic jobs are still rewarded based on the merit system. You have 360,000 total employees in the Texas bureaucracy. They're professional, they're experienced, and it also ensures a hierarchy and chain of command if they're hired based on this merit system. Most arguably, the people with the best merits, those that have the most credentials and things like that, they're the ones that are higher up on the food chain and higher up on that hierarchy. So for the purpose of your test, please know the difference between the spoils and the merit system, and you should be good to go. I think it pretty much is self-explanatory, but if you do have questions, be sure to get a hold of me. Bureaucracy breaks down into three main types. There's administrative, there's service, and there's regulatory sorts of branches of the bureaucracy. Administrative primarily carries out the law established by the legislature. Service types of bureaucracy, they perform duties that could be privatized, but the legislature has chosen to keep them under the function of the government. And then finally, regulatory is self-explanatory. They regulate or control the functions performed within the economy and make sure that corporations aren't violating certain government statutes and things like that. So administrative, service, and regulatory should be pretty easy to decipher between your tests. You can probably think of different agencies that fit under these bureaucratic types, and that way you can maybe try to apply it when you're trying to think about these sorts of things on your test. All right, important topics in bureaucracy that we talked about funding. Funding is huge for bureaucracy. In order for the bureaucratic agencies to function, they have to have a budget. They have to have funding from the state to carry out their own functions. Authority within bureaucracy, bureaucratic agencies have certain types of authority. They also have certain types of governing within themselves. Personnel management, pretty self-explanatory, just once again talking about the spoils versus the merit system. Oversight, we talked briefly about the Sunset Commission and the Legislative Audit Committee. Those are the two commissions, or the two committees, if you will, that oversee everything that goes in the bureaucracy to make sure that they're serving their functions and to make sure everything is running smoothly. And then finally with bureaucracy, we talked about iron triangles. Iron triangles are those close relationships among powerful actors that keep the average citizen out of participating without an interest groups. The iron triangles contain the legislature, the bureaucracy, and then the interest groups. And it sets up this clientele model to ensure give and take between them to make sure that the government actually gets stuff done. Special interest groups get control over the executive branch and agencies and members of Congress, or legislative branch, if you will, to get benefits that others do not get. That's the idea of an iron triangle. And it sets up like this. I kind of showed you guys this little picture when we did the original lecture. This is the idea of an iron triangle. You have the bureaucratic agencies, you have the legislative committees, and then over here you have the interest groups. And they're all kind of relaying information back and forth, and they're doing things for each other that makes them run or that helps them out. And that's kind of the idea of this clientele model of government. You need to make sure that the interest groups are giving, that bureaucratic agencies are giving each other, giving the other two things, and these triangles make sure that everything runs smoothly and that bureaucratic agencies have a kind of say in what's going on. That's the idea of an iron triangle, or as you see up here, sub-governments. They're sub-governments because they are getting things done and helping each other out with this clientele model and with this give and take. So iron triangles can be kind of confusing. We don't think about them very often. We know they're there. We know that they're part of the politics or part of the political system, but we don't really think about them in depth. We just kind of let them kind of happen. And if you're an average citizen interested in getting stuff done, you'll have to join an iron triangle. You have to probably join an interest group to show that, hey, there's a lot of interest for this sort of thing. You need to get the ear of the legislative branch, and you also need to get the ear of the bureaucracy to get your issues on the agenda and to make sure that your interests are really, really heard. That's the idea, or the basic idea, of an iron triangle. All right, I feel like I kind of rambled there, so if you do have questions about them, send them my way and I'll try to answer them. But moving on to week 14, we talked about the fiscal policy here in Texas. What is fiscal policy? Well, for the purpose of your test, please know that fiscal policy is the policies each government adopts in relation to its powers to tax citizens and spend such revenue to benefit the public at large or specific citizens. So fiscal policy, basically just the policy that deals with taxing and spending. Governments can regulate the economy through its power to tax and spend. Governments need to raise money to have a budget. They need to derive their budget from tax policies. But from their budget, they also need to be sure that they're spending it to benefit the public at large. So basically, this just deals with macroeconomics. Fiscal policy goes back to the original idea of what politics is from Harold Laswell. Taxation and expenditures. The game of politics is all about deciding who gets what, and then part of that involves deciding who pays for what. Sorry, let me repeat that again. The game of politics is all about deciding who gets what, and part of that involves deciding who pays for what. So who pays for it? Usually the taxpayers, and then how does the government spend it, and things like that. That's all taxation and expenditures. That's fiscal policy in a nutshell. How government raises money and how government spends money through its powers to tax and spend. Now we talked about the Texas budget. Texas budget is very, very unique. Texas is a large state, but they have to plan out their expenditures, especially 2 years ahead. Because the Texas legislature only meets every 2 years on an odd year, and they have to ratify the budget within that time, they have to plan out their budget for 2 years ahead. That's just the planning stage, and with the changing dynamics of Texas society in general, it can be very hard to plan out the budget like that so far in advance. Now, the Texas budget does have these planning of expenditures. They also have the authorization of programs. They also need to consider employee salaries and benefits. And then they also need to consider what's good for the public at large. Now, the Texas budget establishes certain standards of accountability for programs and agencies. And the fact is that they're audited each year. And so that gets us into the 4 main steps. You have the planning, which makes sense. And then you have the authorization, and that's actually done within the legislative branch. Every time the legislative branch meets, they have to authorize this budget. Now, executing the budget involves just spending. The different agencies of government, they'll spend their allotted budget for that 2-year period, and that's the idea of budget execution. As soon as that budget is executed, then you'll have an auditing stage where the state will actually audit the budget and see how much money they have left over from that budget, if at all, and if the budget was executed faithfully in accordance to how it was authorized. Auditing just basically makes sure that everybody is held accountable for their spending and making sure that everything was spent correctly. Those are the 4 main steps within the Texas budget, and I can guarantee that they will be seen on your test. Now, how do they raise that budget? It's through taxation, and we talked about the 3 different types of taxation in the lecture. We talked about progressive taxation, which is where higher income individuals pay a larger percentage of their income. We also talked about regressive taxation, where higher income individuals pay a lower percentage of their income. So progressive, the more you make, the more you pay. Regressive, the more you make, the less you pay. That's the difference between progressive and regressive. However much you make depends on how much you pay. With progressive, if you make more, you pay more. With regressive, if you make more, you actually pay less, and if you make less, you actually pay more. Now, kind of combining those 2 ideas is the flat tax, meeting there in the middle. Flat tax is just the idea that everyone pays the same percentage regardless of income. And the idea that I usually bring up under the flat tax would be the sales tax. Sales tax is an idea of a flat tax because everyone pays the same percentage in terms of sales tax regardless of how much they make. When you go to a particular store and you buy a particular good, they don't ask you how much you actually make or how much your income is. They're going to charge you the same rate of that sales tax. Even though the guy behind you in line may make a lot more, he's going to pay the same percentage too with sales tax based on how much he bought as well. So that's the idea of a flat tax. Sales tax is flat because no matter how much you make, you're going to pay the same sales tax when you go to the register at this store. All right. And then I finally presented you the idea of where Texas is kind of spending its money. Overall spending per capita, Texas is very, very low. We rank actually dead last in terms of overall spending per capita. We don't spend a lot on employee wages, parks and recreation, cash welfare, mental health, public welfare, public health, highways, and education. All of those things we're pretty low on. The one thing that Texas does seem to spend a lot of its money on is corrections and prisons, which is very ironic and almost very Texan in many ways. But overall, Texas is not just, doesn't spend a lot of money. It also doesn't raise a lot of money either. And that gets us to the idea of the Texas paradox. As an average citizen in Texas, you often enjoy, that was not even a word. Here in Texas, as a citizen, you often enjoy low taxes. Texans enjoy low tax rates. We don't have a state income tax, which is also a huge boost. And then for the fact is, also Texas, sorry, I'm so stumbling over my words today, please forgive me. Also, Texas is also very nice because even though we don't pay a lot of taxes, Texas can still cover a majority of its necessary expenses. The cons, though, is the fact that it doesn't spend a lot. Texas is accruing debt because they don't raise a lot of taxes due to low tax policies. Texas is accruing debt, and also they're cutting services. Because of the requirement to have a balanced budget, Texas has to make sure that they kind of cover their low tax policies with low services. Low tax policies, low public services. Yeah, also Texas has poor public education and poor public services overall, including roads, parks, lands, and health services. So, it's the Texas paradox. We really like low taxes, but we also like nice roads, and we would like a good education, and we'd also like a number of other services. But Texas can't provide that for us because we pay so low in taxes. So, kind of raises the debate, should Texas raise its taxes, should it not raise its taxes and keep it as it's going? Because Texas is actually doing pretty well economically, even though it's not doing well within the public sector. It's this Texas paradox. It's a very worthy debate. You guys kind of debated it yourselves. And it's just something to think about going forward as Texas accrues more population and needs to provide more services for more people. But for now, I'll have to admit, as Texans, we do enjoy low tax rates, which is really, really nice at the same time, but also for the sake of not having good public services overall. So, Texas paradox, what do you really want in place there? Higher taxes, low taxes, good public services, bad public services. So that's the idea of the Texas paradox. All right. And finally, we wrapped up the semester, or this unit, with the economic and social policy with just last week's lecture, week 15. We talked about the different economic eras of Texas. The fact is that the Texas economy has changed quite a bit. It used to be from the 1820s to 1865, and even in up to the early 1900s. Texas was a large agricultural state. We produced cotton, we were involved in subsistence farming, we were involved in cattle, cotton and grain as well. That was Texas's main economy. We had an agriculture-based economy. Texas lands were very fruitful. We were one of the highest agricultural producers in the nation. Then enter the era of oil production. We found oil. Texas became huge in oil wealth, especially as the world's demand for oil increased. So from 1901 to 1920, we were involved highly in oil production. Even up until the 1980s, we were still involved in oil, but maybe in a little different way. From 1920s to 1980s, we evolved into a much more of a refining type of economy. We were still involved in oil, but we were refining it to produce the main sector of our economy. We were also involved in petrochemicals and a lot of related manufacturing that dealt with oil and things like that. So the sizable chunk of the 1900s was dedicated to oil production. Now moving into the present economy from 1980s to present, we're much more involved in electronics, the biomedical industry, as well as a lot of high-tech sort of industries, and that's where Texas' economy is really going. Agriculture isn't what it used to be. Texas used to be solely focused on agriculture. Now, agriculture is still there, but it's not as much as it used to be. We now rank 5th in agriculture production, whereas we used to be 1st. Where Texas really is booming, though, is the tech industry, the health industry, and then the electronics and manufacturing industry. And you see here that Texas is still doing very well. Texas has adopted very, very well into each economic era, and Texas ranks 2nd among the states in the United States in terms of overall gross state product. Texas ranks only under California, and California is a massive state with a large population, so it's no surprise that California is so high on this list. Texas also has a large population, though, and ranks 2nd. In fact, Texas' economy is 14th overall in the world. Now, I want you guys to know, especially for the purpose of your test, the difference between primary versus secondary economic activity. We discussed this briefly in the original lecture, so let's go ahead and go over this just really quickly. Primary economic activity means that you're earning dollars from other areas. You're participating in the consumer economy. You're providing a good to the consumer. You're bringing money in. You're having people pay for your product. You're bringing dollars in from other states. You're selling your goods. You're participating in the consumer economy. That's primary economic activity, the exchange of dollars for goods, or the exchange of dollars for services. Now, Texas is doing very, very well in the primary economic activity, and because so many dollars are flowing into Texas, Texas also needs to be aware of secondary economic activity, meaning that you circulate dollars within the defined area. You're investing in your own sector, or you're investing in your own business to grow your own business. You're expanding, improving business overall. You're keeping your dollars within your area and making sure that your business is providing the best product possible, which also correlates with primary economic activity. If you have good secondary economic activity, you're able to improve your business, you should have no problem bringing in more dollars in terms of primary economic activity. So that's the idea of primary versus secondary economic activity. Primary, you're bringing dollars in. Secondary, you're investing your dollars in your own business. And Texas is doing very, very well in both of these, quite honestly. Texas economy is booming very, very well. Now, we did talk a little bit about the future of the Texas economy, and the fact is that Texas economy will have to adjust to accommodate the massive population growth that it is experiencing. We talked about urbanization. Texas used to be this huge agriculture state. A lot of people used to live in rural areas, grow their food, and participate in terms of the agriculture sector. But with urbanization coming about, a lot of more people are moving from those rural areas and moving into towns. Now, the definition of urbanization that you will see on your test is urbanization is the process by which towns and cities are formed and become larger as more and more people begin living and working in central areas. In Texas, you have Dallas, you have Austin, San Antonio, and you have Houston. Those are the highest areas for urbanization occurring now in Texas. People are moving to those areas. Houston more so than any other city in Texas. Austin has grown quite a bit as well. Now, Texas has already seen the shift from traditional agriculture-based economy to a more high-tech modern economy, but as more people move into the city, the growth of these industries may take over the Texas economy. In many ways, they already have, and Texas will need to adjust to those urban populations, and its economy will need to adjust to accommodate all those people moving in as well. So that's just the brief idea, or at least the future outlook on the Texas economy. And the fact is that the Texas economy is doing very, very well. Urbanization will probably present a new challenge to the Texas economy, but I have no doubt the Texas economy will thrive. But for the purpose of your test, please know the definition of urbanization and at least have some sense of the way that the Texas economy is heading in the future. Now, while we speak of how well the Texas economy is doing, we also need to look at the fact that the growth of the Texas economy is not evenly distributed. The fact is that poverty is more pronounced in Texas than in the nation as a whole. Texas has extreme wealth. Texas also has extreme poverty as well. Texas ranks among the most unequal states in distribution of income. So the rich have really fared pretty well in Texas. And I would even say the middle class has fared pretty well in Texas. Those on the lower end of the economy, though, have not done very well in Texas. Because the fact is that Texas has poor public education. You can see here that it's 50th in the nation in percentage of high school graduates. It's also 45th in the nation in percentage of college graduates as well. So people aren't getting quite the education that they should here in Texas, and that's contributing to the wealth and income inequality of Texas overall. Poverty is also much more prevalent among certain racial or ethnic groups, which is also something to be aware of. The wealth of Texas is not distributed evenly, particularly if you're a person of a particular racial or ethnic group. You can see here that among Hispanics, there's about a 26% rate of being in poverty. Black or African American, 21% in poverty, whereas Anglos or Caucasians, only 8% in poverty. Overall, when you combine everyone together, Texas has a poverty rate of 17.6%, which is pretty high, and it's much more than the national average. And so it'll be very interesting to see if Texas can somehow redistribute the income to ensure that all Texans are enjoying the economic growth that Texas is experiencing. Now, this is a challenge for the Texas economy. The fact is that there's these aggressive tax policies which only exacerbate the problem of income inequality, Immigration is also something that the Texas economy has to deal with, and then also underfunded public service programs such as education, healthcare, welfare, and transportation. Texas will have to increase those public service programs as the population grows, and so that's also going to be a challenge because Texas has those low tax policies, kind of going back to the Texas paradox. So, Texas economic outlook is very, very bright. It's a great time to move into Texas. Texas is doing very, very well. But that being said, there are going to be challenges for the future. But Texas has been resilient so far, and I have no doubt that it can adapt. Texas economy is thriving and adapting. It did weather the recession a lot better than the other states. And then finally, like I've mentioned before, they're experiencing the population growth. And it's doing very well. It's the 14th ranked economy in the world. It's on par with South Korea and Mexico. So Texas economy, very, very solid overall. And definitely something to think about as you guys are going through your education career, as you're looking to enter the real world, start your own family. Definitely something to consider. The Texas economy is definitely something to consider when you think about the future and how your life is kind of taking you and those sorts of things. So just wanted to kind of present those ideas to you. I believe that was the last slide. Yes, it is. So that was the last slide. That's the end of the review. If you guys have any questions, anything that I need to clarify, anything like that, please send those questions my way. I will try to get those answered. But you guys have done so well on the first two tests. I have no doubt you guys will do very, very well. That wraps it up for me. I hope you guys enjoyed this semester. I know that I certainly did. And hopefully you guys have a great summer and do very well in your test. I will see you guys later. Have a good one.